This experience happened to my roommates and me in our second year of university. The city we went to school in was considered a very safe university town. The most we had heard of happening was drunk morons doing typical drunk moron things. This was also the first time that we were all really living on our own. First-year residences are nice, but it's basically an extended summer camp rather than a typical living situation. The four of us girls lived in a nice townhouse that never once had a creepy vibe or weird neighbors in the months we had lived there. The only eerie part was that every weekend we were the only people who stayed in the complex. All of our neighbors either went home or stayed elsewhere until returning Monday for classes. This was never something we had given a second thought to, considering that was fairly normal for a uni town, especially because our complex was only made up of about 4 other townhouses. The complex was surrounded by walking trails and farm fields, which we loved. It was like our quiet spot away from the chaos of college kids. There were a few farmhouses we could see from our backyard, but other than that, we were fairly secluded. The university was about a 20-minute bus ride away, which was never a big deal for any of us, especially because the rent was far cheaper here than in places that were within walking distance to campus. Being 5'6", I was the tallest by a considerable amount. I was also the only one out of the group who had been in a handful of scary situations. Due to this, I was the only one up to this point who would lock the doors, windows, and garage before leaving or going to bed. My roommates all grew up in small, very safe towns, so it was uncommon for them to lock doors back at home. They were also incredibly kind and trusting to everyone, never considering hidden bad intentions. The night in question started very normally. We had planned on having a wine and movie night. This was kind of like a weekly tradition for us. We would pick out some stupid movie, get takeout, and get a little buzz after a long week of classes and work. At this point, it was early November, so we had been doing this for several months with no issues. By 8:30-ish, we had all settled on the couch in our living room and had started a comedy. With it being November, it was already completely dark outside. Other than our porch light we could see from the small window at the very top of our door. None of us were tall enough to see anything out of that window anyway, so we relied entirely on our peephole. It took a great amount of effort for me to convince my roommates to check the peephole before opening the door. This was a talk we had after one roommate had opened the door for our neighbor's very drunk friend who threw up all over our main floor. Not long after ordering our takeout, we heard banging on our front door. Jess made a joke about how the delivery guy must have taken a helicopter to get here this quickly, especially considering the place we ordered from was very close to campus. It was not a typical delivery guy's knock either, but between the few glasses of wine and carefree attitude of the night, we didn't really pay it too much mind. It was my roommate's turn to pay this week. I'll call her Meg for the sake of the story. Out of the group, she is the smallest, barely 5'0". She is also the most trusting person I think I have ever met. She ran up to her room to grab her wallet. This took at most 30 seconds. During this time, the banging continued and was getting more aggressive. I figured maybe it was cold or he had other shit to do, so we yelled up to get her to hurry. The banging continued to get harder and harder, and I started to feel a bit uneasy. When she came back down, I told her to check the peephole before opening it, as she was usually the one to just open up. She got to the door and looked out the peephole. She could barely reach it on a good day, so when she said she couldn't see anything, my other roommate and I got up to help. My second roommate, I'll call her Jess, is a very funny person. There are very few things that she would not turn into a joke. Jess got to the door before I did and looked out of the peephole, the person on the other side still banging away. When she turned to look at me, I knew something was wrong. She looked incredibly confused, a look I had rarely seen from her as she was very clever. Within a second, she had gone back in for another look. This time her face was not confused. She looked afraid. This made my stomach knot up. She is a horror movie fanatic and she doesn't scare easily. "I think someone is covering the peephole," she shouted at us. This time I looked out of the peephole, seeing that, yup, something was covering the peephole. We could still the porch light shining through the window at the top, so we knew it was not a case of it being too dark to be able to see what was going on. By now, our other roommate, whom I'll call Anne, had walked down the hall trying to find out what was going on. She was easily the drunkest of the four of us. Even sober, though, she seemed to think she was invincible. "What is your problem? Open the door. The poor dude has his hands full," was Anne's wise idea. Jess and I explained what was going on. At this point, Meg, Jess, and I all had a gut feeling that something was wrong. That is when Jess asked Meg to check the website she had ordered our food on. Meg had not placed the order. Between the wine and the silliness of the earlier night, she had selected our food but did not finish the last step. The banging continued as our situation started to sink in. Anne still did not seem to grasp what was happening and tried to unlock the door. "Stop!" I snapped at her. Immediately I knew it was too loud. For the first time, the person on the other side of the door spoke. "This is the police. Open the door now. We have a few questions to ask you." A man's voice practically growled back at us. This sobered me up right away. I looked over at Meg, who was already welling up, then at Jess, who had gone completely pale. At this point, Anne also realized something was not right and froze, which is the least Anne thing she could have done. The banging was getting increasingly harder, to the point we could physically see the door breathe with each hit. Meg took Anne upstairs, trying to calm each other down and check if there was a police car parked outside and make sure our windows were locked. Though it was hard to do, it was possible to get onto part of our roof that made it possible to get to Anne's window. We heard a window slam, immediately knowing that it had been Anne's window. Being a bit of a thrill seeker, Anne had taken out her window screen in order to sit on the roof. For some reason, this made what was happening very real. "Show me your badge, then we'll open the door," I yelled back. Instead of a response, it sounded like the guy started to kick the door. I told Jess to call the police and ask if they had an officer dispatched to our address. Jess was shaking so badly at this point that it was hard for her to dial. Now Meg had come back down the stairs, sharing that there was no police car parked outside. Anne trailed behind her, standing on the stair landing, trying to get a look outside the window at the top of the door. At that moment my blood ran cold, remembering that the man at the door had said "we" and not "I." Jess had just come to the same realization. She sprinted to our back door, a large sliding glass door, which she double-checked that it was locked. Thankfully it had been. She drew the curtains as well, trying to minimize the chance of them seeing in. Within a minute, the knocking started at our back door as well. Thank God she had closed the curtains, because the idea of seeing whoever was doing that still gives me chills. "Uncover the peephole and show me your badge," I yelled again, trying to sound as intimidating as a young college girl could. We were met with silence, which was so much worse than the banging. "What is your badge number at least? Prove to us that you are the police," I screamed, trying to keep my voice from breaking. The only response I got back was a gravelly, "I can't do that." Jess had handed her phone off to Meg, who was sobbing now, trying to speak to the dispatcher. The banging now, coming from both sides of the house, must have been heard by the operator. "Is there someone trying to break in?" she asked Meg, obviously being unable to understand her. Meg frantically asked if police had been sent to our house. The answer we all knew by now was no. Meg babbled that at least 2 men tried to get us to unlock the door by impersonating a police officer. "Try to stay calm. Stay on the phone with me. Police are on their way to your address," the operator told Meg. "How long will they be?" Meg asked back. "No more than 10 minutes, she responded. That made Meg cry harder, realizing just how long 10 minutes really is. The door was being hit so hard I worried it would break. Jess ran back toward our back door, making me worry that our kitchen window had been open. Trying to think, I put a chair under the doorknob and sat down, hoping the door would hold. Jess came back to the front door holding a kitchen knife and a fire extinguisher, which were the only things we had to protect ourselves with in case they got in. Anne, now sitting on the landing, flinched with each hit. Anne was farm tough and had no issue dealing with animals 3 times her size. What was happening now, though, was entirely different. We had nothing to really deter whoever wanted in. No prods and no backup until the real police show up. Not like what she was used to. She grew up having family as her neighbors her whole life. If anything were happening, her uncles and grandfather were at her front door in a minute flat. Anne's "I'm invincible" attitude was long gone. She was now as scared as the rest of us, only having some wood and glass keeping these men out. Each hit to the back door made me expect whoever was there to break through the glass. "Open the fucking door!" the man yelled at us, not caring if we thought they were police anymore. Then it got very quiet again, which made me want to throw up. The only thing worse than what was happening was not knowing where the men were. The idea of both men moving to the back door made me absolutely terrified. If they really wanted to, It would very little effort to smash through the plate glass. Instead, the knocking at the back door had completely ceased. Within seconds of that, the front door started being hit again. Trying to wrap my mind around why they would leave the easiest entry for a heavy wood, I realized the back door was visible to the main road. Whether they had seen a car or heard us talking to the police, they were smart enough to not want to be seen by anyone. Jess then said something that I had not thought of. "I don't think they want to rob us. There are so many houses that are empty. Why would they come to the only house with the lights on?" she hissed. My whole body went cold. I did not have an answer. All I could say was, "Fuck, you're right." Meg clearly felt the same because at this point she was practically hyperventilating. The three of us stayed quiet for a minute, awful scenarios running through our heads. Anne moved back up the last few steps and out of sight of us. The operator, who we had forgotten was on speaker, spoke, which practically made me jump out of my skin. She must have felt how terrified we were and tried to calm us down. "The police are 2 minutes away. They have their sirens turned off and the lights are on. You should be able to see them very soon. Stay on the phone with me so I can confirm when they are outside for you," she said. The men outside were starting to seem desperate. The sound of glass shattering had me turning to the back door, fully expecting to go into a fence, but the door was still intact. Instead, our porch light, the only light illuminating our dark street, went out, which put 2 and 2 together for me. Understanding that they had destroyed the only way we would have been able to identify whoever was on the other side. "Fuck you, little whores," a voice we hadn't heard before, whoever was at the back door, spat. This was worse than the initial speaker. It was full of so much hate and venom that it scared me more than the banging. He was so calm, intent on whatever his goal was. It didn't feel like how the first man had sounded. Up until this point, I could have convinced myself that they had wanted our valuables, but this voice made me understand that he had wanted us. To this day, I have never heard a voice come close to that level of malice. It sounded like he wanted to inflict serious harm on us, and if he had gained entry, I know he would have. Somehow I wanted the first man to speak again instead of whichever sick bastard had just spoken. I looked at Meg. I know how terrified I must have looked. Until now, I may have done a half-decent job of hiding how scared I was, but that voice ruined my ability to stay stone-faced. Meg looked like a scared little girl, and that made me panic. If they got in, there was nothing I would be able to do to stop them. Not for me, and not for my friends. We would have been at the mercy of the monster outside. Jess had practically stopped breathing. It was like the oxygen had been sucked out of the air. It was so quiet it sounded like a gunshot when our mailbox opened. Anne ran back down the stairs. "I see the sirens. They're coming down the main road now," she whispered, hoping not to have the men hear. The same man spoke again one more time so slowly that I almost thought he was done after each word. In that same awful, calm voice, he read out a letter addressed to the 4 of us. Our neighbor must have put it in today. She had planned a potluck for the next week. None of us thought to check the mailbox after we had talked to her in the driveway this morning. "Jess, Meg, and OP. Those are nice names. I'll be back soon, girls, then we'll have some fun." I felt tears rolling down my face. I hadn't realized I had started crying, but I knew he meant what he had said. I tried to pull my mind out of the dark pit that sentence had sent it to, waiting, praying that the police had surprised them, hoping they would not get the chance to come back. The silence continued. None of us dared to speak, worried that we would not hear if they moved to another point of entry. Instead, the silence persisted for what felt like a lifetime. The operator was the first one to speak again, telling us that the police were out front. She told us to stay in the house until the police knocked on the door. The kind woman stayed on the phone with us for several more minutes while the police searched around the area. Finally, the real police showed their badge to the peephole before even knocking to try not to scare us. The operator told us that we had done well and that we were in good hands now. We opened the door to be met by 2 kind-looking older police officers who we let in. Glass shards covered our front stoop from our porch light. It looked like it had been ripped out of the wall and smashed onto the concrete below. There were several police cars out front of our previously quiet home. The headlights on all of the cars were shining down the street towards the walking trail. We spoke to the officers who took a report from us. They asked us to describe the night's events in detail. They asked us if we saw them at all, and we explained how the peephole had been covered and the light had been smashed before moving away from the door. The officers advised us to speak to our landlord about, at the very least, security cameras. The older officer then closed the pad he had been writing in and looked up at us. He then spoke a phrase that made me understand how much danger we had been in. "Look, if any of you were my daughters, I would have wanted the officer to tell her, if you can get out of your lease, do it. They know where you all live, and they also know the response time for us, especially after telling you all that he would be back." After that, they asked if we had heard a vehicle. That was something I had not considered. We did not hear any type of motor until the police were there. Even when Meg and Anne had one to look for a police car, they saw no cars on the street at all. So likely that meant they had come from the walking path, which would explain how they left without passing the police on their way back to the main road. The older officer of the two had a look that told me he had an idea of what was going on. He looked sad, which was worse than if he had looked scared. I knew he had seen this situation end far worse in the past. We pushed for an explanation, but were only told that this had been an issue years ago, but did not elaborate past that point. The officer stood up, exchanged a glance that I did not know how to read, and then spoke again. "We will have a cruiser parked in the driveway, as well as a plain car around the back. They will not have a chance to try again. They did not catch the men in the 2 more weeks we lived there. We had a few creepy things, but nothing close to this. The reality was they had not been caught, and they could come back any time." After this night, we spoke to our landlady, who was incredible. She owned several properties around the city, and when we explained what had happened, she let us move to an apartment closer to campus. She told us that our safety is more important than making a few $100s. She even left the house empty for many months in order to make sure cameras, better locks, and a reinforced back door. Thankfully, they did not come back, and we were able to enjoy our new apartment without worrying. This is still so scary to me because of that voice. Make sure you lock doors and check who is there before opening the door.
And that concludes another episode of Creepy Limes, where we delve into the unsettling and inexplicable encounters that send shivers down your spine. If you enjoyed these chilling tales, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more unnerving stories. Before we part ways, we want to hear from you. Have you had a creepy encounter you'd like to share? Drop it in the comments below, and who knows, it might be featured in our next video. Your stories make this community truly spine-tingling. Remember, the world is full of inexplicable moments that can send a shiver down your spine, and we're here to explore them together. Stay curious, stay vigilant, and most importantly, stay safe out there.